Howdy and welcome back to Beyond the Pew. My name is Taylor Stroll and it's great to be here with you sitting on this tree stump talking to you about the Old Testament. Now this is an old tree, but it's not 2,000 to 4,000 years old like the Old Testament is. A lot of people look at the Old Testament and think, oh, it's this boring old book and I can't understand it. And so we're going to address some of those things. First of all, it is kind of hard to understand. We'll address that as we go on. The second thing, it's not boring. You're either not reading it at all or you're reading it wrong. A lot of times, especially your kids will hear stories of like David and Goliath, and it's like, oh yeah, he slung his sling, hit Goliath in the head, now Goliath's dead, story's over, right? No, the story keeps going. It's the adult version that your kids don't hear when they're at Vacation Bible School. David hits him with the rock, takes Goliath's sword, and cuts Goliath's head off, and then picks up his head and shows it to the Palestinians. Like, this book, this collection of books in the Old Testament is a heck of a lot of fun. So much fun that when I was in an Old Testament class when I was in undergrad, the teacher wanted to call it, instead of like Old Testament 101 or whatever, he wanted to call it lust, greed, and war, because that's essentially what this Old Testament talks about in these stories. So a lot of time, why are we talking about the Old Testament with you guys as parents? Well, in working with your kids, they have tons of questions about the Old Testament. Like, why did God flood the earth? Why was are we all descendants of Noah? Why did all the unicorns have to die? You know, these really important theological questions that people are wrestling with. And I think if you and I are able to look at the Old Testament and get help in understanding it, we'll be able to help our kids in answering some of these questions, some of these kind of odd kind of stories. And I'm not gonna be able to cover all that now, but I can point you in the right direction. There's some great resources, like Catholic Answers will answer a bunch of these questions, like why did God flood the earth and all of these kinds of things. So if your kids ever ask a question, just go look it up. Catholic Answers is a great one. If you've ever gone through the Bible Timeline from Jeff Cavins, the Great American Bible Timeline. So much great knowledge in there, and they actually have one built for teens if you wanted to go through it with some of your teenagers by Mark Hart. I've done it with in youth ministry with a lot of our young people as well, and I've gotten a lot out of it, and so have they. So I'd encourage you to do that. So what is the Old Testament? First and foremost, it's a collection of books. A lot of people will look at it and see, oh, like they'll try to argue scientific facts or historical facts, and that's like trying to say that a poem written by Edgar Allan Poe isn't historically accurate. Like, that's not the point of that poem. So we have to understand there's a collection of many different books. There's wisdom books, there's prophetic books, there's historical books, there's teaching books. There's all these different kinds of things that the authors are trying to accomplish, that God is trying to accomplish through these inspired writers. So it's all of these scriptures are for us to know the truth, but not necessarily specific facts about these things. So what the Old Testament is that it's the New Testament concealed. So when we are reading the Old Testament, it's a story of God's people waiting. It's the story of 2,000 plus years of the Israelites, the Jewish people, waiting for the Messiah to come. We're in this season of Advent now, and we too are in this season of waiting for Jesus to come into our hearts in a new way in this Christmas season. And you can imagine, you know, I remember as a kid waiting for Christmas morning for weeks and months. Imagine waiting for 2,000 years for this Messiah to come in the midst of heartache, in the midst of them losing their kingdom, in the midst of just deep wanting for Jesus to come. And it doesn't happen for quite some time, and then finally it does. And an example of this is Abraham. So the Abraham story, you've probably heard the story about when God asked him to sacrifice his son. You know, God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many of great nations, finally gives him a son, and then he asks him to sacrifice that son. And the story really makes no sense when you read it in its own context. It's only in the light of Jesus that we can understand this story, because Moses had his son Isaac carry the wood for the sacrifice up to the mountain himself. And then you all know how it happens. Abraham goes to sacrifice his son, and God says, no, don't do that, stop. And then as he's explaining to Abraham, he said, on this mountain is where I will show you what love is. And so there's a ram or a lamb caught in these thorn bushes, and they go and they sacrifice that lamb instead. And if you think about it, at this point, Abraham's an old man, his 80s, 100 years old, and Isaac's around 10 years old. Like, Isaac could have run away if he wanted to. And so we look at all this and we're like, what does this all mean? Why did God ask him to do it? And it's really hinging on that line that this is where God will show what true love is. And that mountain in the Old Testament was called Moriah. That mountain in the New Testament had a new name. It was called Calvary. It was the same place where this is the mountain where God was going to show his love, where he sacrificed his only son for you and me. He was, you know, the lamb was caught in the thorn bushes. Jesus had a crown of thorns upon his head. He had to carry the wood up for his own sacrifice. We see all these parallels and that make it make sense thousands of years later. So if you have questions, if your kids have questions about the Old Testament, check out those resources. You can always ask us to shoot us an email or a social media post. We'd love to help you out as well. So that's the Old Testament. I hope to help you guys out. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll be back next week on Beyond the Pew.